Hello and welcome to VarnVlog Solo. And today we're going to be talking about the Prairieland Incident of July 4th, 2025 and its legal implications, as well as its implications for strategy and tactics. I will be relying on both the public record and also an article published in the Liberal Currents on July 30th, 2026 by Samantha Hancox-Lee, which is also a tactical and strategic analysis. And I'm going to be responding to that and also using my 5-level framework that I've used in the last couple of videos here to break this down and talk about it in a variety of ways. I want to make it clear that when we talk about the strategic and tactical implications of this, there are 2 levels in which we're talking about how to respond to the federal government's increasing use of terrorism powers for domestic policing, and especially in regards to kind of symbolic throwing the books at activists, which we've also seen. It's not new. We saw this going all the way back to the Earth Liberation Front in the early aughts and the Green Scare of the late George W. Bush administration. But it is really accelerating in the willingness to go all the way here. But we're also going to talk about some of the tactics and strategies used by activists, which I sometimes still think of Alex Williams and Nick Schreinick's critique of left-wing habitus or left-wing habits, where we continue to do things because they're part of our culture and we haven't questioned their efficacy or their risk to reward ratio. And I do want to talk a bit about that too, because it's something we have to do. And I do think we can talk about that without in any way justifying what was done to the nonviolent offenders in this incident. But first, we need to talk about the incident itself. And it's come up in a lot of interviews and whatnot on my show. I often will have my aphasia kick in and call it the Prairie Fire Incident, which is wrong. That's more from the 1970s, and it's not one thing. But this is about the Prairieland Detention Center in Alvarado, Texas, which was housing federal immigration detainees during heightened protests against mass deportation policies, which have been going on now for 2 years. This incident escalated into a high-profile federal terrorism and shooting case, resulting in federal convictions and lengthy sentences, even for nonviolent offenders. Nonviolent offenders might be contested, so we can talk about that. So, a group of Dallas area activists organized what was framed as by the defense supporters as a noise demonstration outside the facility to signal solidarity with detainees inside. According to court documents and federal prosecutors, a core subset of the participants coordinated via encrypted chats, I think mostly through Signal, which were uncovered by some Apple policies. That's interesting. Conducted prior surveillance of the security measures and arranged a gear check where a Black-Bloc clothing, firearms, body armor, and trauma and medical supplies were gathered. Around 10:37 p.m., approximately 11 individuals near the detention facility, protesters set off fireworks towards the facility structures, spray painted vehicles and the guard shack, and slashed tires on the government van and disabled a security camera. Unarmed ICE officers called local emergency services. The police arrived. Alvarado Police Lieutenant Thomas Gross arrived at the scene and ordered the participants to stop. During the confrontation, a demonstrator identified in court as Benjamin Hanel Song opened fire with a rifle, striking Lieutenant Gross near the neck collarbone before the rifle jammed. Most participants were arrested near the scene shortly after, and while Song fled and was apprehended a few days later, on July 15th, 2025. Federal prosecutors charged all the members of the group with federal terrorism enhanced statutes under 18 U.S. Code 2339A, which includes enhanced punishments for material support for terrorists. This is a something that goes back to the Patriot Act, and something that both libertarians back when they still cared about that kind of thing, and I used to warn about as an implication of the Patriot Act, since everything else is already covered under existing law and could have been punished without reference to the Patriot Act. So they were charged with rioting, conspiracy, discharge of explosive and fireworks, and attempt to murder a police officer. Benjamin Hanel Song was sentenced to 100 years in federal prison. His co-defendants, which I won't all name, received sentences ranging from 50 to 70 years. 7 additional individuals pleaded guilty prior to the trial for material support to terrorism. The U.S. Justice Department frames the group as a coordinated Antifa cell. We can talk about what the hell that means, since Antifa is not a single organization, that carried out a premeditated armed attack against law enforcement and a federal detention infrastructure under the guise of protest. How clear it is that it was premeditated is still not clear to me looking over the documents. Activists, defense attorney, and civil rights advocates argued that the majority of participants attended a peaceful solidarity noise demonstration. They contended that applying federal terrorism statutes to the entire group set a dangerous legal precedent aimed at criminalizing all protest activities, particularly anti-ICE activism and dissent, which seems pretty clear. Now, that's just the facts of the case, all right, as reported in court. There's a bunch of things to deal with and look at here, and we have a bunch of frameworks to do it. In her article, Prairieland Tactical and Strategic Analysis, which was published in Liberal Currents, Samantha Hancock-Lee provides a strategic critique of direct action tactics used during the protest at the ICE facility. Setting aside any moral arguments or justifications, she evaluates the actions purely through tactical effectiveness and strategic outcomes. And we're going to look at this in a broader scenario, because I think you do have to look at this in more than just tactics and strategy. You also need to look at grand strategy. You also need to look at orientations, epistemological backgrounds, et cetera, to get a complete sense of what was going on. But I have to admit that I do wonder how wise these kinds of things are. And the logic here is an old Marxist logic where we are very careful about individualist protest and individualist assassination attempts and stuff like that, because their potential to lead to backlash without leading to much political gain. And like, this goes back to Lenin, this goes back to Marx. So we already talked about the incidents. If we move past the moral argument, the author argues that great evils require effective remedies. Evaluated strategically, the Prairieland action was a complete failure. It resulted in mass arrests, gave the government a legal and propaganda victory, expanded prior policing powers by doing so, and failed to ignite a broader anti-ICE movement in any significant way. The theory of action needs to be looked at and dealt with too. What is the operating theory of action here? What are the orientations, to put it that way, that motivated the Prairieland incident? All right. Drawing from radical zines such as War in the Streets that influence the activist book club, Hancock-Lee outlines in this article what the activists hope to achieve. Minor attacks of direct actions were theoretically meant to combine with political messaging to inspire mass public participation, while the noise protest was to signal solidarity to the detainees. This is propaganda by the deed, and it's an old left tactic that I have never actually signed up for. And I'm not saying this to throw these activists under the bus. What has happened to them is at least to all but the actual shooter, is unjust. Right? I want to be very clear on that. But the injustice of what happened to them doesn't change our ability to analyze this and analyze this as a means of operation. Hancock-Lee says the tactics completely failed to connect with the larger goal of dismantling the deportation machine. It didn't inspire a mass movement, not even something as mass as the protest against Cop City, which also failed, but at least had mass support, or sympathetic coverage. The action alienated mainstream legal and advocacy groups such as the ACLU, who refused to take the case, which is actually somewhat weird and a little bit cowardly on their part, but whatever, and failed to gain positive cultural traction despite the draconian punishments that were inflicted on a lot of the people involved. Activists brought firearms under the logic that, they could protect themselves, hoping to deter armed counter protesters who may show up. They weren't actually aiming to deter police, and Hancock Lee admits that. But introducing guns into a confrontation introduces extreme unpredictability, particularly when you're not a mass organized force. This is a point that I've tried to make over and over again. Political violence is part of politics, unfortunately. You can decry political violence, but what people do when they decry political violence is they're decrying the level of political violence or who political violence is aimed at. Political violence is implicit in politics. However, introducing guns to this sort of protests is extremely unpredictable, particularly when people try to respond to the police, who are almost always going to outgun you. There are asymmetric realities you have to deal with here. Right-wing groups who often benefit from sympathetic or tolerant policing do not take the same brunt as leftist activists when they have guns, who, particularly when they're engaged in property destruction, cannot expect police cooperation. Now, I don't think you should be expecting police cooperation ever. All right. And I do think that Hancock Lee maybe is a little bit Pollyanna-ish on this one point, but I do think this is something that you need to think about. What is the risk to reward ratio here? What are you likely to achieve in engaging with a shootout with a cop as a small group? All right. Particularly when you're engaging in property destruction. You know what the police do, you know what they're for, and you know that they outgun you. Public reaction is also not going to be very sympathetic, and this is something Marxists have talked about going all the way back to Lenin and his critique of the Narodniki assassinations that his brother was involved in. Unfocused public disorder, street clashes, and vandalism generally push the general public towards reactionary stances because they don't know what's going to happen, and fear tends to implicate and bring in reactionary beliefs. The combination of shooting an officer alongside Black-Bloc aesthetics make it effortless for the government to frame the entire group as terrorist, even though that is manifestly unjust and unfair. Hancock Lee also goes into how activists employed the standard security culture OPSEC measures, using signal, wearing Black-Bloc attire, disabling phones, parking at a site. While OPSEC tactics may shield activists from minor charges during routine protest, they completely fail when major violence occurs, or even minor violence occurs. Shooting a law enforcement officer draws a full investigative rate of federal and state authorities. You know that about the United States, about most countries, honestly. Rendering a tactical OPSEC useless when giving the state ample evidence of premeditation and conspiracy during prosecution, because the OPSEC tactics can look like admission of conspiratorial guilt, even if you are trying to protect yourselves. But there's a couple of things I want to critique Hancock Lee for. One, there's a hindsight bias here. Hancock Lee treats the group's actions as if they were executed under a single unified top-down strategy that was directly intended for the officer to be shot. There's no evidence of that. We don't know what Song was actually thinking. Decentralized activist groups, especially affinity group structures, are rarely monolithic and hard to control. And this could be a real critique of the affinity group method in general. By evaluating outcomes through the lens of a single failed doctrine, Hancock's risk applying a top-down military framework ends means ways to an informal collective where individual actions, such as one person choosing to keep and use a rifle, often diverge wildly from collective intent. She conflates one individual's panic or rogue decision with the strategic failure of the entire group's methodology. But to defend her a little bit, Hancock-Lee is right that they should have considered this as a possibility, that this could happen. All right. Another thing I would point out about some of the weaknesses of Hancock-Lee's argument as a strategic and tactical affair is that the uncontrollability of violence section contrasts the Prairieland incidents with Luigi and Mangione or Charlie Kirk, noting that targeted political violence sometimes receives sympathetic online reactions while generalized disorder tends to turn the public reactionary. Comparing a targeted assassination to a spontaneous escalation at a protest creates a false distinction, though. The positive online reaction of figures like Mangione is largely an anomaly of algorithmic echo chambers and also high levels of frustration where people can project some sense of hope upon an individual actor. But this is not evidence of large public approval of the actual action. And even if it is publicly approved, it's publicly approved in a way that most people still don't copy it. All right. Labeling the Prairieland action as a directionless public disorder ignores the fact the process has a clear targeted institution and a clear targeted aim. So it wasn't without any tactics or strategy, even though Hancock-Lee is right that there was a lot of disorder, a lot of inability to figure out what's going on, and a lot of what they did to plan for the situation actually made them look guilty of conspiracy. Hancock-Lee phrased the security culture as a trap because it backfires because it fails against the full force of state surveillance following a major crime. But security culture is not designed to defeat state intelligence agency after an officer-involved shooting. Its primary focus is to mitigate everyday surveillance, prevent preemptive mass arrest, and protect participants doing routine civil disobedience or other actions. Whether you think those actions are efficacious, and I largely don't, is beside the point. Criticizing public operational security because it fails during a worst case scenario misrepresents what OPSEC meant to achieve and why it would have been used in this instance. Because it does not seem like the majority of the group actually had an interest in shooting a cop that they did not even know was necessarily going to be there. So reading it this way by Hancock-Lee is a bit problematic, to say the least. The author argues that activists failed because their tactics prevented them from securing sympathetic coverage in the mainstream media or gaining support from liberal institutions like the ASOU. But radical and abolitionist movements historically operate from the premise that the corporate and mainstream liberal institutions will never be sympathetic to cover their actions when that they directly challenge state infrastructure or proper. Expecting direct action groups to design their tactics around mainstream media palatability assumes reformist strategies that activists themselves do not hold. And frankly, I'm not sure works under the current environment. Anyway, since we know that some people get targeted by this who have not engaged in violence and have ignored the situation. Another thing that we can accuse Hancock-Lee of doing is focusing almost entirely on the choices and areas of the activist, asserting that their choices made it easy for the government to charge them with material support of terrorism, which is fair. But by focusing exclusively on activist doctrine, the article understates the aggressive state prosecution and the political expansion of the definition of terrorism, which has been something expanding for the past 30 years. And frankly, I would expect this from liberal currents, to be frank with you. They seem to be part of the progressive populist technocratic fusion that's trying to revitalize the DNC, and they have the blind spots that one would expect from that. Now, I think Hancock-Lee is right about a lot of the limitations of this as strategic. I don't know, even if this had not led into a cop being shot and people getting arrested, that we would have called this a success. It would have been just another bunch of activists doing another bunch of activist things. These things happen all the time, and their effect is minimal. But sentencing nonviolent co-protesters under terrorism enhancements represents a massive deliberate escalation by the state apparatus. One that has been signaled for a long time. Like I said, going back to the use of Patriot Act provisions against the Arab Liberation Front and the aughts. So we have more than 20 years of this. There's actually history of this even before we had the Patriot Act, but this is where it's really expanded. This escalation was unlikely to matter whether the activists follow a clean or normie-friendly protest aesthetics or not. So I want to point out those limitations in Samantha Hancock Lee's analysis, but I do want to give her some props here for asking some hard questions that we don't often get asked around these kinds of events. There are some strengths that we need to look at here too. Debates around direct action and radical protest usually descend into moral posturing, either condemning activists as reckless agitators or lionizing them as heroic martyrs, leading us all to more action by propaganda by the deed. Hancock Lee deliberately strips away the moralistic language to evaluate the event purely through strategic and even a utilitarian lens. I don't actually agree with the utilitarian lens, but it is one that we should at least consider. This allows for a sober assessment of where specific actions actually advance or hinder a political cause. Now, my thing is there's also no military analysis of this in some ways, even though I think a military analysis of this would also show this to be a clusterfuck. But we should not just do an optics analysis as a way to win people to your side, as liberals often do. Could this have been a success on other grounds? And I don't think so. But Hancock Lee doesn't take that cold of a reading. The article accurately addresses the political reality regarding armed protest. Right-wing groups frequently brandish firearms at rallies with minimal pushback. But the author points out the left-wing anti-state activists cannot expect the same leeway from police because they're not seen, and rightly actually, as defending the status quo. Acknowledging the double standard forces activists to contend with the world as it is, rather than as they think it ought to be. Operating under the assumption that an armed society is a polite society ignores institutional alignment between law enforcement and right-wing elements. And even when those right-wing elements are targeted by law enforcement, which they they often are not done with the gusto that they target left-wing ones. That's a fact. And that has to be taken into your way of handling the situation. I'm also not sure that property violence has ever been shown to have the galvanizing effect in support that the Black-Bloc advocates have said that it should. The historical origins of the Black-Bloc in Germany are actually quite different than how it was used in the 1990s to current in radical circles. I'm not saying that the Black-Bloc is never ever appropriate, but I would actually be very limited in when I say it is appropriate. Hancock Lee also makes a sharp observation regarding the different forms of violence and disorder impact the broader public. She correctly identifies that generalized public disorder, particularly of low-key violence, actually tends to drive fence-sitters towards law and order reactionaryism because they see themselves as being possibly victimized by it. Whereas other, even more violent acts, such as we mentioned Luigi Mangione, may not be viewed in the same way because people know that Luigi probably would not go after them and they were unlikely to be collateral damage in such an attack. That is a separate logic that needs to be parsed separately. And a lot of people don't. So by contrasting this with how easily the state painted the activists as terrorists, she highlights that aesthetics directly shape media narratives and judicial outcomes. And that's true. However, I don't think that's the only thing we should be concerned with, as I said above. Rather than writing off Benjamin Song's shooting of a police officer as an isolated incident by a hothead, which it probably was, but doesn't really have much effect one way or the other, she traces the likelihood of this happening back to the underlying culture and rhetoric of the group. Carrying long arms with an explicit mindset of I'm not getting arrested. I would say long arms are interesting because they don't really have the same self-defense logic. They can be seen as a deterrent against other kinds of armed activists. But again, I haven't known of that many shootouts between left-wing and right-wing protesters. Some did happen during the height of BLM in 2020, but even that was remarkably rare given the scale of that event. I think when you introduce deadly weapons into an already tense confrontation, you have to be able to plan for and accept the probability of escalation, both lethal and not. Intention matters very little once live rounds are introduced in this kind of environment, and you're not going to be able to control the outcomes if you're not in a military-like discipline situation. Sorry, that's a fact. This is why Marxists have always talked about, like, you know, political violence needs to be mass, and it needs to be probably defensive, ideally. You know, I also think Hancock's-Lee gives us a practical purpose for political organizers by treating Prairieland as a case study in tactical failure. Movements rarely learn from their mistakes if failed actions are immediately reframed as romanticized martyrdom. Martyrs are cool for personal mythology. They're actually not so great for tactical winning. Sorry. By breaking down how a noise demonstration turned into, you know, massive prison sentences and a massive legal victory for the government, which enabled them to expand their own power, this does provide a cautionary framework for future organizing. This tension needs to be dealt with. Now, beyond the immediate and tragical failures highlighted in Hancock-Lee's essay, the Prairieland Incident and its legal aftermath carry some broader political, organizational, and legal implications that I think we need to think about. Charging nonviolent protesters with material support of terrorism based on shared messaging app, attendance at the same book club, and possessing common printing equipment drastically lowers the threshold for state repression of anyone. This creates a framework where any participant in direct action, whether or not they knew a weapon was present, can be held legally liable as a co-conspirator of terrorism when one person acts unilaterally. It effectively turns collective organizing into a high-risk criminal conspiracy in the eyes of the law every time one happens. And that's the point, right? That's what all these terrorism laws were aimed to do. You don't need them under normal legal circumstances because everything that is punishable was already illegal. Shooting a cop is already against the law. You don't need terrorism charges to do that, but you do need it to basically jack up the sentencing from, you know, material witnesses and rioting to something that you can put a bunch of activists in jail for having zines in jail for like 50 years for. This has broad spectrum impacts, and it really does need to be addressed. It should not. When asking escalates into an officer-involved shooting labeled as domestic terrorism, established civil liberty groups typically retreat to protect their own legal standing because, you know, they have their own NGO level concerns. This creates a severe rift between radical direct action groups and mainstream reformist organizations that comes up a lot, actually. It's not just in these severe cases, but the severe cases make it even more likely. Instead of building broader coalitions against deportation facilities or even trying to build a broader, like, socialist response network to this, the incident forced broadly sympathetic liberal institutions into a defensive disavowal. Now, they're going to disavow it anyway. I mean, this is one thing you have to deal with, but the plausible deniability about why they're disavowing it is a lot more viable in this case, particularly since a song shot first. For years, federal and state prosecutors struggled to legally construct Antifa as a formal organized domestic terrorist enterprise rather than a loose, decentralized ideology. They've been trying to do so now for since probably the Obama administration, definitely during the Trump administration, it lessened to some degree during the Biden administration, but didn't completely go away, et cetera, et cetera. But by combining encrypted signal chats, Black-Bloc aesthetics, physical scenes found during the raids, things such as the Emma Golden Book Club, federal prosecutors were handed a textbook evidentiary package to use like a RICO statute almost to validate executive designations of left-wing groups as militarized anarchist networks, which they aren't, and this doesn't prove, but you start laying the groundwork for what looks like a criminal conspiracy. I think that should be taken seriously. It has massive strategic implications, and people really should listen to how to deal with that. We're going to have to deal with it more than just calling it bad in the future. I also think that the belief that bringing firearms to direct action serves as a deterrent against armed counter protesters or police overlooks a fundamental imbalance of force, particularly when you're dealing with police. With counter protesters, it actually has some logic to it. Although, again, there has been violence between protesters. Armed violence has happened between protest and counter protest groups in the past, but it's actually remarkably rare. So introducing lethal weapons to an environment where activists are already committing property crimes guarantee the state will respond with a full monopoly on violence, both on the ground and in the courtroom. And it's a fight a decentralized civilian group cannot win. You'd need, I don't know, a lot more than that. You can draw your implications of what it is to really deal with that. All right. Another thing to look at is the vulnerability in decentralized movement. And loose, non-hierarchical affinity groups, a single individual's decision can collapse the entire group's collective legal defense and political intent really easily. And the lack of discipline makes this more likely. Traditional OPSEC measures often create a false sense of security that encourages reckless tactical planning despite the planning into OPSECs. Now, I'm not against OPSEC measures. I'm not, particularly today. But, I think they don't shield you against a federal investigation. And in fact, they can be used as evidence of a criminal conspiracy. So let's apply my, 5 layers of political action framework to this. Now, again, I've already critiqued myself as a kind of auto critique on the limits of this framework. I know what it is. But it is helpful for kind of breaking this down and how I would respond to it. The action itself, a noise protest featuring fireworks, tire slashing, spray paint, Black-Bloc clothing, and bringing firearms such as handguns and AR-15s for counter-protest deterrence is questionable as far as public sympathy goes. Analyzed purely as tools, these tactics failed, according to Hancock's Lee. The noise demonstration did not spark a riot of their anti-ICE mobilization, even though there's been sympathy about the extent of the prosecutions. Before that, the prosecutions were severe. Very few people talked about this. The OPSEC collapsed under the weight of an officer-involved shooting investigation, and in fact, many elements of the OPSEC, the operational securities, were used as proof of conspiracy. Bringing long arms transformed a low-level property action into a lethal encounter, and the long arms is actually important here because long arms are not particularly defensive weapons, and that in of itself can be used against you as proof of premeditation. Now, the issue then becomes if they were knowingly going to engage in violence, and we're just drawing no moral, analysis of that violence. This is also a stupid way to handle it. It's too decentralized. There's no unified response. There's a tendency to scatter. All this is a problem from a military perspective too. So activists treated Black-Bloc aesthetics, street disorders, and non-postures as a self-justifying mode of action, almost as a left-wing habitus from left-wing movements going all the way back to the 1970s and 80s, and definitely since the 1990s when this was adopted after the Battle for Seattle. These come out of a zine-based subculture that has a lot of repertoire, but are not really tailored to specific terrain and the audience of Alvarado, Texas, or in general. I'm going to tell you the history of these things working is actually rather low. All right. The debates about the Black-Bloc on moral grounds during the WTO protest, I remember Hedges being against them, Chris Hedges being against them, and other people being for them, always to me missed the point. The point was that it was tactically insufficient and freaked people out, and also yet did not do anything about the primary causes of the environmental damage in the case of ELF or the ice regime in the case of this case, that it doesn't actually, and in no way can you even really see how it would deal with the actual threats at hand. It doesn't do so on either a civic political grounds or on a military one. The mid-level plan to build momentum against massive proportion regimes by using direct attacks to communicate ideology is a strategic belief in propaganda by the bead, and it depends on it inspiring public participation and signaling solidarity towards the detainees. Hancock Lee says that the strategy is completely decoupled from tactical reality. The activists lack the mass base or the boots on the ground required to absorb or capitalize on the confrontation event anyway, particularly in Alvarado, Texas. Instead of building a broader political coalition before action, the tactical execution alienated sympathetic institutions like the ACLU and gave state prosecutors an effortless victory. I would go further. I would say trying to win over the things like the ACLU is probably not wise anyway, but that it is something that is a problem. Like, if the ACLU is afraid to take your case, you do have issues. The plan assumed that direct actions would naturally trigger a public activation. No, 10 flyers for every flying blick is the way. Chaotic disorder and cop shootings in particular have never had that effect. In fact, there's study after study proving they have the opposite effect. Mass level political violence or even targeted assassinations can occasionally have public sympathy or even public support, but they're masked, they're disciplined, they're organized. They don't appear as random, and that's important. In context of grand strategy, which I don't know that we can easily apply here, the overall theory of social transformation, direct action, insurrectionary tactics without military discipline, dual power building are supposed to dismantle state repression and the deportation apparatus over the long term. This doesn't build dual power. There's no counter institution that these activists would have had to deal with the situation. There's no militia to be a counterforce to the general police. There's no way to even protect the inmates by this action. So as a way to build dual power, it fails. As an insurrectionary tactic, it invites repression without having massive gain. So the risk to reward ratio for violence is actually just not there. And direct action, particularly when paired with OPSEC security, can be used to level against U.S. terrorists. It's a mismatch between the movement's grand strategic ambition and the state's asymmetrical power. The anarchist grand strategy often envisions degrading state authority through decentralized friction, and that's actually tended to help reactionary groups more than anarchist groups, even though anarchists are the people who came up with it, because it tends to scare people into supporting the status quo. In a way, the activists failed to account for the structural reality of the modern state power. They operated as if decentralized groups engaged in armed confrontation with law enforcement without triggering the full overwhelming counterweight of state repression. And they flirted with the use of violence in a situation where they did not have strong tactical discipline and control, even if they had operational security. A liberal thing about orientations here is actually going to be quite interesting. And this is where I really disagree with Hancock Lee. An anarchist abolitionist framework interprets police as inherently illegitimate enemies with whom no negotiation is possible, while viewing direct action and armed self-defense as necessary postures. I would say Hancock Lee argues that the orientation blinded activists to basic tactical realities. For example, right-wing groups bring guns to protest successfully because their orientation aligns with, or at least is tolerated by, state forces as long as they stay within certain parameters. And when they get out of those parameters, the state does punish them. Left-wing anti-state activists bring guns, guarantees an aggressive police response even faster. And often, in the case of where these things have happened, usually there's more anarchists that die in one of these confrontations than right-wingers for a variety of reasons. Think about what happened in Kenosha, where the police basically cattle trained a bunch of activists in direct confrontation with right-wing activists, which led to the Rittenhouse shooting. Not here to talk about the morality of that. The police, however, were able to utilize non-state actors as a means for violence by curtailing a relatively unorganized protest directly into harm's way. And I've actually wished that when people talked about this, we weren't talking about the morality around Rittenhouse so much as that specific action and why people didn't see it. right? Because we still don't talk about it in that way, and that's what it was, right? I'm willing to say that now. I'm tired of people yelling at me about it. I'm not here to talk about Rittenhouse one way or the other or condemn the activists involved, but there were guns. They were more brought out. There was other non-weapon assaults that happened. 2 people died. 1 person lost their hand. The right was not convicted, but all of that was set up the way that the police corralled the protests in the first place. So right-wing quasi-paramilitary elements even were used by armed forces to get out of, the normal restrictions that police live under. If you set up a fight and one side has more guns, well, you know how that's going to go. All right. So, while I do agree with Hancock's Lee that this doesn't deal with tactical realities, I don't think that means that there's never, ever a place for violence. I'm just saying that it has to be very carefully calibrated and should be very disciplined and with mass public support before it is engaged in. And that rarely ever happens, I'm going to admit. Hancock's Lee basically argues that the orientation led to activists being so locked into confrontation and non-cooperation they could not objectively assess their actual vulnerability or the reaction of law enforcement and local juries in the situation, or they thought their OPSEC would protect them more than it could. Either way, your orientations led you to a blindness lower down this framework, right? Principles here. Foundational moral imperatives by a lot of anarchists are the following: there's human dignity, solidarity with immigrant detainees, anti-authoritarianism, and a belief that great evil requires great remedies. The core thesis of Hancock Lee's essay is that pristine moral principles are a deep sense of ethical outrage is utterly useless if it isn't backed by an effective, realistic strategy. I would say either military or political, or both. I mean, one is the extension of the other. But these sorts of things don't show, thoughts on any of them. Graffiti, great evils require great remedies expresses high principle, but activists substitute it, a kind of intensity of moral outrage for a strategic calculation. Hancock Lee counters that great evils require effective remedies. Without strategic efficacy, noble principles yield long-term prison sentences, and no single detainee was actually helped. And that latter part's the important part. Martyrs who achieve something, maybe that makes sense. Martyrs who don't, well, I don't know. And like I said, outside of song, I don't think most of us would argue, regardless of your orientation, that this was just. But that's not the point. Justice is not the point of a strategic analysis. And I would differ with Hancock Lee on some of her concerns. I don't think we need to be worried about running of the ACLU. I don't think we need to be worried about sympathetic media coverage. But that's what makes propaganda by the deed so problematic, because it assumes that the propaganda by the deed spreads your message positively. That's the theory of change behind propaganda by the deed. Frankly, there's no evidence that that's true in almost any case. In the case of very targeted assassinations, you can get some public sympathy. But even then, people don't copycat it often for obvious reasons. I didn't do this shit on the Prairieland activist. I'm very sad about what happened. The expansion of state counterterrorism powers domestically can be a nightmare on a variety of reasons, because basically any crime with a motivation can be called terrorism under these provisions and statutes. I also think that's why leftists should have been far more consistent about when they screamed terrorism in the past. Even right-wing terrorism, we should probably not pursue under terrorist charges, because the facile friend-enemy distinction doesn't often come out in your favor in an asymmetrical power analysis. The person who sets the exception is the person in power. even from a Carl Smithian logic. This means, in a lot of ways, that we need to get smarter about this. We need to think beyond the spectacular as a means for motivating public action, because it frankly doesn't work. It's a habit of activist culture that was cultivated in a different time. We have a half century of praxis that proves that it has very little efficacy. We need to stop it and do other things. I do not agree with Hancock's Lee that all those things need to be good liberal things that, necessarily win positive media criticism and get liberal institutions on our side. It's good if they are, but that's kind of irrelevant. Particularly in a time period where those institutions are more afraid of the state than they have historically been and are more cowardly than they have been in other times. And I'm not afraid of calling the ACLU a lot more cowardly than in its heyday, when it would defend communists and fascists with equal gusto out of some principle that it no longer seems to have. But that's the logic of NGOs for you. So I don't entirely endorse Hancock Lee's assessment here, but I do think it's important to think about strategic realities and not just talk about this on moral terms. Yes, what happened to most of those protesters is unjust. Absolutely. And I don't usually use the term justice, but even by my loose and rare uses of the term justice, unjust. But setting up an expansion of such powers is not a benefit of anyone. Political violence should not be so frivolous, and people involved should not be acting unilaterally on their own orders, because this is what happens. Many unnecessary fight begins this way. Very few of them lead to a Crispus Attucks in an American Revolution. And with that in mind, and even more importantly, protect your peace. And hopefully we'll see some better justice for the protesters that didn't shoot. I'll link the article I'm responding to down here. And we'll also talk about, like I said, I think it has some severe liberal myopia. But you should read it, and you should start thinking more tactically when it comes to tactics. Sarah Stein Labrato, who I have reached out to and haven't heard back from. So I would love to interview her. So if you know her and you can get her in my orbit, I'd appreciate it. Says the reason why we do protests is to build internal solidarity and to remind ourselves that politics is in the meat space, but not to win over public sympathy, because it doesn't really work. And she goes through 100 years of proving that. With these kinds of spectacular propaganda by the deed issues, this is doubly and triply true. The moral righteousness of the cause is not actually going to be relevant here. And yeah, sometimes individual events like John Brown sparked this, but John Brown was for all of his insanity, that was a planned and deliberate attack. It wasn't a noise attack, right? So these mythologies where we make analogies of history to stuff like this often are fallacious anyway. So as you engage politically, regardless of anything else, make sure that you make risk-reward calculations, not just OPSEC calculations in your actions. And with that note, protect your peace. You'd like and subscribe, hit the bell, and you can find more behind the paywall at Patreon for as little as $4. I feel really weird doing this one at the end of this one. This one feels too serious to be plugging at the end. I don't know. Anyway, we're going to end here. Protect your peace.